Now people should be able to hear me. And all of you. All right.
Hello.
Hi, hello.
And then I should switch over to my phone and retweet myself. So, not that I don't know that what we'll have in terms of viewers or people who join us in the stream, since we're not usually streaming at this time.
Well, I mentioned it on my stream a couple of hours ago with Nord
Yeah.
Games, so hopefully we get a few viewers from there.
Nice.
Yeah, I just retweeted, so my mother will
There you
be
go.
on. But that
Perfect.
would be it.
Yeah.
My favorite is when we're doing behind the DM screen and Mike's mom joins us. That's perfect. That's the best.
Great.
That's the best contributor ever. All right, Tracy, did you finish the conclusion?
I did.
Fix it so that since I completely forgot that it existed. Beautiful. All right. Well, should we chit chat a little bit, or should we just jump right into it?
I'm easy.
You're the boss.
Well, I just know it's... Well, I guess it's maybe not super late for you, Josh, right?
No, it's okay. Yeah, it's 9 o'clock here, 10 past
Okay.
10, so... Yeah, I've got
Nice.
time.
All right, well, in any case, we'll get started either way, because, I got about an hour and a half before I need to have dinner on the table, so...
Okay.
Let me...
Yeah, Fred and I were trying to figure out the. Okay, so you're doing a podcast here. I'm gonna go get Freddie here. Well, how do we get dinner in the oven?
Right. Well, I appreciate you making that work, so...
Yes, and hopefully we won't have a small goblin join us at the end.
And if we do, that's all right, too.
That's it.
Sometimes that's how a campaign ends. Small goblins show up, and you all go home.
Writing that down.
Ooh, next adventure. Small goblin shows up, says goodbye. It can show up in a small sort of shrinking window and say that's all, folks.
Yeah, because you never know when that small goblin's gonna say it. Fun part.
I was thinking with a top hat and a cane.
Ooh,
Singing,
yeah, there you go.
Hello, my honey. Yeah.
I did teach him how to take a bow at the end of a performance,
Ooh.
so he at least has
nice.
that
Nice.
going.
That's an important skill to have.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go ahead. I guess I should say, Josh and Sean, have you met each other?
I don't think so, no.
No.
So,
It's a long swim.
Sean Merwin, Josh, aka JVC Perry.
Oh,
Yes. Yeah. Hello.
Avid
Nice to meet you.
listener of your podcast.
Well, thank you. Avid follower of your work.
Thanks.
I figured the two of you are around enough, sort of in the community, that almost certainly you'd run into each other at this point. But I'm happy to make those introductions.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's a growing community, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gets bigger by the day.
All right then. Let's go. See, now I've got a good 2 minutes of us just chit chatting that Sam will have to edit, but that's okay. I mean, it's just cutting it out, so it's not a hard edit. All right. I think we're good to go. Then I'll get started. This episode of the Tome Show is brought to you by AwesomeDice.com, the most awesome place to get dice. And listeners like you, thanks for using the Tome's Amazon and DM's Guild affiliate links, and for being patrons at patreon.com/The Tome Show. Welcome to the Tome, a D&D news, reviews, and interviews show, and I'm your Tome host, Jeff Greiner.
And I'm Tracy Hurley, and in this episode, number 346, we're going to keep fighting evil or good, whatever, after we beat the big bad villain.
And joining us for this episode are two fantastic guests. First up, coming at us from across the pond, a designer who's written a few campaigns that end at level 12. So we brought him here to ask him, okay, so we finished your story. What do we do next? Welcome back, Josh, a.k.a. JVC Perry.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, I need to fill in those blanks, right?
We're going to put your feet to the fire. Also joining us on this show is the nicest man in the gaming community, the host of the Down with D&D podcast, sometime writer for Wizards of the Coast, including a lot of Adventurers League adventures, and a relatively recently announced game designer for Ghostfire Gaming, Sean Merwin. Welcome back.
Hey, thank you for having me, Tracy. Jeff, great to talk to you again. Josh, great to see you, even though I'm sure we've emailed a few times.
Awesome. And I'd like to take this opportunity to remind folks that if you'd like to see Tome Show recordings live and unedited, you can watch us record at twitch.tv/Tome Show or later on YouTube. And also be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Discord. And don't forget that this episode of Tome Show is brought to you with the support of AwesomeDice.com. Not only are they sellers of some cool dice, but they also offer a subscription box. You can choose to have a new box of dice delivered to you anywhere from once a month to 3 times a month. Each curated selection of dice worth $30 to $35 for the cost of $29 to you. Check them out at awesomedice.com and be sure to tell them the Tome Show sent you.
And I should correct that because I wrote the script that Tracy just read. It's not 3 times a month. It's once a month to every 3 months. Which is a very different thing, but that's okay.
What if you want it 3 times a month?
I mean, I guess you could get 3 different subscriptions.
There you go.
But I think they only do 1 curated set per month. So, Yep. All right. So the topic today, I want to start off by sharing a little bit of an email that I got from listener Sam Thompson out of Asheville, North Carolina. Sam describes that they're a relatively new DM and have been consuming a lot of D&D content, and they're really into it. But notes that all of the Wizards published adventures tend to end around level 12. They describe that they're currently running, it seems like they're running Rime of the Frost Maiden, and they're like, my players, there's no way they're going to be ready to give up on these characters at the end of Rime of the Frost Maiden. What do you do, right? He says that he sees a couple different options in that you run the adventure and then you sort of cobble together some modules and homebrew stuff to go through the next 8 levels. Or that you, cobble together some modules and homebrew stuff together at the same time and sort of stretch it out over more levels. Those are the options that they describe imagining, but is curious, what some experienced players and DMs think about. What do you do? And it's actually, it's timely that I got that email from him, because it occurred to me independently around the same time that, the Wizards Adventures, with the exception of Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which I continue to contend isn't really an adventure. It's a location where adventures happen, but that's me splitting hairs. Other than that one, none of them really go beyond level 12. And that seems to be sort of the norm, right? Is that levels 1 through 12 is the norm for D&D, published D&D adventures. Even outside of WotC, we gave Josh a hard time in your intro, but you've written a couple of big campaigns, right? And they both go 1 through 12. And that seems to be the standard. And as I was talking about before we started recording, I even find that most of them don't really, not yours specifically, Josh, but think of the WotC adventures, a lot of them don't really come to what I would call a very satisfying conclusion to a campaign, right? They come to an end. That arc of the campaign comes to an end, but it doesn't feel like a very satisfying ending for those characters. With a few, Descent into Avernus, if it ends one specific way, sort of has a satisfying conclusion for the characters and for the story, right? Tyranny of Dragons kind of comes to a satisfactory end. But most of the adventures, even the really good ones, don't feel like they come to a real strong sort of satisfactory end. So what do? You've run the published adventure. You want to keep going. What do you do? And I want to start off by opening it up to y'all. I've talked way too much as we've gotten started. So what do you all think before I throw in some guiding questions? What can you do?
Well, I think I think we could start about talking about why do we think maybe they do finish there. And I think at least from a design perspective, there's probably a real broad swathe of reasons. But certainly for me, when I'm writing, a lot of it is that kind of the challenges that are provided for us to use, at least on the DMs Guild, through things like the OGL. They're geared towards those middle two tiers, tier 2 and tier 3. When you look at magic items and monsters and that kind of stuff, the high CR and the real legendary items are a lot rarer, I think, by design. And so it's kind of harder to design at that high level, not least as well because balancing encounters at that level is really tough, right? So in the early levels, it's kind of a bit wonky, characters not got much HP. It could go either way, especially, you want to throw out an interesting encounter, so you don't just want to have a couple of goblins every time. So you want to design something that's intriguing and involves all the pillars of play. But really, at low levels, that's difficult to do. In those middle tiers, you've got a bit more leeway. Characters are more versatile. Their kind of abilities are working together in a more cohesive way. And so it's easier to design encounters, basically. It's when you get to those really high levels that all of a sudden, especially if we're talking about 9th level spells, once you've unlocked those, it's everything's sort of kind of out of the bag. You can't predict at all. So I think to some extent the reason why we see campaigns finishing around 12th, I try to stretch some of my work to 15th, but especially 16 and above is really difficult to design for in a calculated way, I would say.
Yeah, and Evil John in the chat also points out that I think it was Tyranny of Dragons also goes up to about 15th ish, which makes some sense. But yeah, and you hear a lot. You've heard a lot from Watsy about how most players don't play up until those higher levels, which is a bit of a chicken and the egg thing, right? Players don't play there, so we don't design adventures there. But of course, nobody's going to play there because there's no adventures to run there. And I recognize that for smaller publishers or an independent publisher like you, Josh, that's a particular issue that is limiting. But Wizards of the Coast, they designed the game. If anybody should be able to design adventures to 20th level, it's them. So and this isn't a review of the design process, but I'm not exactly willing to let them off the hook. But either way, so Sean, you were going to say something?
Well, the first three long published adventures, Tyranny of Dragons, Elemental Evil, and Rage of Demons, all went to 15th level. And I believe Wizards of the Coast when they say there really isn't a market for higher level adventures. I think that bears out on the DMs Guild sales from people who've written high level adventures, thinking there are no high level adventures out there. I'm going to corner the market on high level adventures, and then they publish one and they get a quarter of the sales that they would for their low level adventures. So I think that does bear out. It also bears out in my experience over the editions. And I've said it for AD&D and 2nd edition and 3rd edition and 4th edition and now 5th edition. High-level D&D is stupid. It really is. Because by the time you get those characters to the tier 4 now, or even tier 3, depending on how you run your campaign as a DM, you could have power variations in those groups that are incredibly wide. If you run a low magic campaign, those high-level monsters in the monster manual will wipe a party out easily. If you run a campaign where you let your players basically pick their magic items and handpick all of their abilities from various source books, they will be able to wipe out a high CR monster in 2 rounds. And there is no way as an adventure designer to take that into account. Even trying to go for some middle ground, you end up pleasing no one. And so that's why I think that Wizards, by choice also doesn't want to highlight that sort of disparity because it doesn't speak well design. Not that they designed it poorly, but what's the thing that got play tested least? High level abilities. So, just by the design process itself, it's hard to make that work.
And then,
Yeah.
and a lot of that has to do with the balance and I'll call it crunch parts. But one of the things I picked up on what Jeff said was this idea of a satisfying ending for the characters. And I feel like once you've gotten to that level, it's hard to write a generic adventure that feels satisfying anyway, because there's so much history with those characters and things that are going to only really be for your particular table.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of like if you think about, it's almost like parallel universes, right? Comparing different D&D groups running through the same adventure, because take Rage of Demons Out of the Abyss for an example. At the very beginning, they're in a setting where there's loads of other NPCs that they could latch onto or fall out with and stuff. And one group will go down one path of these branching decisions, and another one in session one might decide, I don't like this little mushroom guy at all. I'm not going to spend any time with him, and that's taking them down a totally different path. And Tracy's absolutely right. You can't predict those. I mean, it's saying the obvious for D&D, right? You cannot predict what the players are going to do.
Well, and I would even argue, like, it is appropriate when you get to especially when you get to level 15 plus, your adventures should be not even just world shaking, but like universe shaking events, right? You are dealing with the gods themselves, and there's a degree to which I could see, like, Wizards is publishing adventures that really matter to the setting. But at the point that you're running to 20th level and you're talking about destroying pantheons, kind of thing, that may be more change than they're willing to do, especially after the blowback when they did some of that in 4th edition with the Forgotten Realms, right? So
there's always the lore people you have to make sure are pleased with your edition. Otherwise, we go down the 4E path of you changed our world. It is the worst thing I've ever seen, and then you have to deal with that. But I think if you wrap it back to an unsatisfying ending, one thing that you can do as a DM is at the very start of your first session 0 of your campaign, ask the players, what is the exit strategy for your character, regardless of what adventure we play? Mm-hmm. What would be a satisfying ending for your particular character? If you keep that in mind, then you can start to weave that into the adventure on your own. So when the adventure ends, you can hit that happy place for each character. So it does feel like things are wrapping up, even if the plot of the adventure itself isn't completely satisfactory.
Yeah, or at the very least, like a lot of the adventures, the published adventures have started at least having little sort of epilogues at the end being like, and here are some other things that you might do if you need. So, and you could throw in not a full arc, but maybe a few more levels just to wrap up the player stories and what have you. I'm hearing at the very least, whether we decide to hold publishers of adventures accountable to this or not is not really the issue, right? But that at the point that you get to 12 plus, 15 plus levels, the story should shift to being both massive and very focused on the stories of the characters. And so that's harder to publish for, but a DM still has to run that game, right? They still have to keep that campaign going. And so Sam suggested that you could you homebrew completely from then on, maybe tag in some modules here and there, and then the question becomes, how do you take those modules and ramp them up to being level appropriate, or start the campaign from the beginning as sort of a mashup of modules and stretch them out over a longer period of time. I've actually done both. My last campaign was me mashing up a bunch of modules, and it lasted through, it was at least 18 levels, maybe 20. And my current campaign is the other one where we've done another, and now I'm sort of homebrewing and bringing in elements from other stories to make it work for higher levels. But I'm curious what you all think in terms of solutions.
Yeah, I think we've sort of touched on the main things that I would consider already. So I think it's inevitable at this point that you, in your campaign, you're going to have to do some kind of home brewing, especially because of the individual characters. So I think the first thing is, when we think about D&D or really any role-playing game, what's the one element of them that's entirely distinct from the mechanics, from the crunch, from the levels? It's the role-playing element, right? It doesn't matter if you're level 20, your role-playing is still the same. You've still got the same kind of backstories to interact with and that sort of thing. So I would, like Sean was saying, think about and talk to your players about what personal arcs their actors want to go through, and what would be a satisfying journey for them to undertake. That after the campaign is finished, as it were, that's the perfect time to be thinking about, how can I move their personal stories forward and beyond what we've already achieved, essentially. So maybe even take some time to reread the character backstories and see, is there anything actually that I've missed here that I could throw in? And if you can find a module, maybe even a module from an old edition, because then players are going to be potentially less familiar with it, is there any way I can kind of link these bits together? So an example would be in my own game when I ran Call from the Deep, one of my players was looking to, come to some accord with their brother who turned to a dark side, kind of a typical D&D story. And in order to do that, they needed specific magic items. So I was just thinking, where can I find high-level adventures that are based around magic items being stored away? And so for me, White Plume Mountain was the obvious choice. It's a complicated adventure. So even if the mechanical elements aren't necessarily high level, the fun of it is actually in working it out at the table anyway, and finding those kind of modules where, especially puzzles and stuff, tend to be kind of level neutral. It's about utilizing those kind of things that you can get away with no matter what level the characters are at, I think.
Yeah, that's actually similar. You're talking some similar advice to what I'm doing actually right now with my current campaign, right? So we ran Dragon Heist, and then we ran Curse of Strahd, and I figured, and one of the things I would add to the advice is look at this story that you've told so far and figure out, where the natural next steps are, right? So I mashed up Dragon Heist and Curse of Strahd, and I said, well, in the Amber Temple, you got all these dark powers, and they're the real villains of Ravenloft, right? Of Barovia. They're the big bad evils of the whole thing, and one of those sarcophagi is broken. One of them's already escaped. Well, I've said that happened 2,000 years ago in the realms, the last time Strahd was defeated, and the Amber Temple, along with the rest of Barovia, was brought back to, it used to sit in the Valley of Waterdeep right there, with the castle up on Mount Waterdeep, and the one that broke out chose its champion, and that is Hallister, Blackcloak of Waterdeep, right? And so he's just been biding his time this whole time and waiting for Barovia to return again. And as soon as it does, he breaks out all of the dark powers, and they fly all over Faerun, and they all choose champions, and now that's the third act, right? I took the existing story and I said, okay, so let's just bring this to its natural evolution and see where it goes, right? And then I decided one of them is where I'm following Josh's advice here is I looked at my own players, and one of them had this backstory that sort of had come up in roleplay of his family. He's a Ghostwise halfling from Methwood, way over on the other side of the continent, right? And his family, his wife and child, were killed by the necromancer, just some random necromancer. It was never really detailed. He didn't know what was going on, and that's what set him on the path to becoming an adventurer. It comes up every now and then in roleplaying, but hasn't really been dealt with. And so I said, okay, this is the time to deal with that. That necromancer has been chosen as a champion of one of the dark powers. Now you've got to go deal with that. What am I going to do? I don't know. Here's what I'll do. And so I'm yanking the entirety of the dungeon from Tomb of Annihilation, and I'm saying the necromancer was a Sararak all along, and now you've got to go to the Tomb of the Nine Gods from Tomb of Annihilation and deal with that, and that brings in your puzzle point. Like, the combats in Tomb of Annihilation end up being, so far, we're only 2 sessions into the dungeon, they're a cakewalk, right? The players are having no problem wiping out Tomb Guardians and the dwarves and whatever, right? They're not a threat. But they're still real jumpy. Every time there's another puzzle or a trap, or they're poking everything with their 10-foot poles. They're level 13 and they're poking things with 10-foot poles because they're all a little on edge about the whole thing still. And so that's sort of how I've done that, right? I took what existed, I drew it out to its natural conclusion, right? Descent into Avernus. I said that it has, maybe this might have been pre-recording, but I said that it has one possible ending that is a satisfactory sort of conclusion for the characters. But if that's not the one that happens, there are natural sort of conclusions to that. Figure out where that would go and continue the campaign from there. You saved Elturel, but nothing else was accomplished. What are you going to do now, right? There's all kinds of places you can go. Sean?
A lot of the published adventures do have sort of, they have some hints, but it's definitely not enough for, especially a beginner DM to run from this one paragraph of here's what might happen next. One thing that I've liked to do in the past is people seem to gravitate or like stories where there is sort of a repetition, where they go back and revisit what they've done before, but it's new and twisted. So if you can find a way to, during that last battle, something happens and the characters are, they fail, but they have to go back and they have to sort of go through some scenes again that they've already done. They have to go back to the dungeon that they were in, and now there's new monsters, but what they did before informs what story you lay in front of them going forward. So you get to, this is where the rogue backstabbed the big bad guy and killed him in a round. Well, now it's the rogue that gets backstabbed. It just it increases the length of your story. 2, it gives you that repetition that people love in their stories, and harkens back to things that happened. It's hard though as the DM, because then you have to remember what happened. You have to sort of take notes, and you have to be ready to do that. But when you do that, you have all the maps already. You have all the monsters already. You have the tools that you need. You just need to put those stories together now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on a similar note, it's not that easy, I think, even for beginner DMs to scale up existing 5th edition material. A lot of the time, the guidance is there. So if you look in the Dungeon Master's Guide, it does provide just generic DCs for stuff. If we're starting at the real basics, you can see it's pretty easy to scale up a trap just by increasing the damage, increasing to hit bonuses, increasing save DCs, and that sort of stuff is provided for you in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and especially in Xanathar's Guide if you've got it. And then with monsters, I'm a big fan of reflavoring, and I think this is something I really learned from Mike and Mike's book is, just if it says Tomb Guardian, fine, describe it as a Tomb Guardian, but just use the Tarask stats if that's what you need to do.
Right. That's quite the upgrade.
But a lot of the time the players aren't going to notice at all, and even if they do notice, are they really going to care? I don't think so, because really what we're doing is investing ourselves in a narrative, right? I think most groups care more about the narrative than they do about the stats. So I think as long as you've got that kind of buy-in from your group, they're not going to mind if you're running a CR30 monster instead of like a CR7 one.
So honestly, so we're talking about going into homebrew at the later levels anyway. I can say, 'cause as somebody who doesn't ever publish anything, right, I don't really care about the balance and all that, because if I end up picking things and it's wrong, I can fudge it at the table and I can make it work. Right? If it's too weak and I need it stronger, I can make it stronger. If it's too strong and I need it weaker, I'll make it weaker. I can do that on the fly at the table pretty quickly and easily. That's not, and honestly, like when I'm running the dungeon from Tomb of Annihilation with my group right now, and the fights are all cakewalks for them, I'm kind of okay with that too. Like, you've gone through a lot, you've become very accomplished. Like, it's okay to feel competent. Like, let them walk over the Tomb Guardians. Like, I don't need them to be the Tarask, because the dungeon is hard enough with the puzzles and the traps, and then at the end when a Sararak shows up and whatever. Like, there's enough troubled there. I don't need the fights to be balanced. I'm okay letting them feel accomplished and competent and all those kinds of things. That's fine, and that's honestly one of the things that you play higher level D&D for, in my opinion. Like when Sean says high level D&D gets stupid, what I'm really hearing, I know what you mean, but what I'm really hearing is high level D&D becomes D&D superheroes, and that is a style of game that I'm here for. Like, I've run it enough that I enjoy that kind of game.
Yeah, and that's, if you enjoy that kind of game, that is great. But the I say it laughingly, D&D is stupid, high level D&D is stupid. But it's all about the balance, right? It's all about, as a designer, it gets stupid.
Sure.
As the DM, like you said, you could do whatever you want. You can adjust things on the fly, and that's where the DM becomes most important, not just as a narrative facilitator, but as an actual adjuster of the mechanics to make it work for your particular group.
And trusting yourself as well. By the time you've played through 1st to 12th or 1st to 15th, you're going to have a handle on it. So I think to new DMs who are just starting off with level 1 characters, the idea of playing 18th level is terrifying. Like, I definitely speak for myself, it was. When I first started DMing, I was flying by the seat of my trousers. I didn't know what I was doing. But once you've got to 10th level, you kind of understand how all the bits fit together, and it's not going to be so daunting once you're there. I think a lot of the time it will feel like just a natural extension of what you've already put in place.
Well, and when there's a like the email that originally came in about this was somebody running Rime of the Frost Maiden and not wanting to stop at level 11 or 12 or whatever it is. And there is potential epilogue hooks for Rime of the Frost Maiden in particular that I find to be particularly interesting, that might lead you to a nice deep dive into the lore of the setting and fun and interesting wacky things that you could do. And I've been giving the advice for I don't know, it's been a long time, a decade now, that like, are you going to mess up the setting? Are you going to screw something up and change the setting and make it non-canonical? Yeah, and own that. Like, that's the point. Like, this is your setting now. Blow it up and make it your own. Like, don't care about how you're going to mess it up. And then, oh no, but now I've changed something and this god is gone, or this pantheon is gone, or this city doesn't exist. Yeah, who cares? Whatever. That's your story. In your version of the setting, that's the way it is now. Or not. You can change it back next time you start another campaign. So that's all, like, and the epilogue to Rime of the Frost Maiden has particular potential to do that, right? And I say embrace it. Own it and move forward with it and have fun with it and do the research and dig into the weird little corners of things that haven't been thoroughly explored that could be in really fun ways. I think that's a lot of fun. We've talked also a lot about playing things off of your characters, your players' backstories, and tying up their loose ends and whatever. And I think it can be easy to sort of zoom in on a few key players or characters in that situation, and I encourage everybody to not just focus on those few, right? Also, think about the loose ends that might exist for other characters, right? I've tried to, in my current campaign, I'm into the homebrew third act, as I call it, and I have tried to throw in a little something for every character. Right? There's a little, the one character who has had a rival that's shown up going back to 3rd level and keeps popping up and just won't die. He was, of course, chosen as one of the champions, and it was one of the first ones they fought. So she got to have a satisfying conclusion of finally beating that guy. What she doesn't know is that, these are evil, dark powers of undeath. There's no way he's staying dead just because they defeated him. So he's also going to come back as their last opponent to defeat, but she doesn't know that yet. And then I've got the one guy who's the necromancer from his backstory, and so we're dealing with that, and that's a Sararak. And I've got the one player who's the paladin of Torm, who's been, who's got a mentor who got lost and whatever. They found him in Barovia, and now he's going to head off to Elturel and help with the fight there, because Gargoth, the hidden lord in the Shield from Descent into Avernus, is one of the champions of the Dark Powers, I've decided, and they're going to defeat him by trapping him in the Shield, setting things up for a later campaign in Descent into Avernus. And but that's him rushing to the aid of his paladin order and what So I've tried to, even if it's a little bit pat, right? It feels a little bit contrived. Oh, we have all these dark powers, and each one of us has one that happens to be sort of connected to each of us. You know what? If we were running campaigns 3 times a year, that might feel formulaic. But given that these things take 2 years to run a lot of times or more, like, lean on those tropes. Use the formulas because they work.
Right. I mean, we can't sit here and say formulaic is bad when we're running essentially, the same 2 stories over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? Like you said, formulas work. My point is, if you're a DM and you take a party from 1st level to 12th level through an adventure, and they still want to play, congratulations. You've done a great job, and you know what you're doing, because you have people that come back and want to keep playing. Mm-hmm. So trust yourself to keep going in whatever direction you feel like it, because I know a lot of campaigns that because I run them, that no one wants to play. No, that you get to the end of the story and they're like, okay, we're fine, we're ready to move on. Mm-hmm. But another thing to think of is, do the players want to keep going because the story is doesn't feel like it's over, or it's because those characters don't feel like they're over? If it's because they want more story, that point about NPCs, you can go back to 1st level and start with them playing these NPCs that they've come to know and love, and you're continuing the campaign just with different characters. So that's another way to do it, where you don't necessarily need to go on to 13th, 14th, 15th, and higher, and then you have plenty of campaigns to choose from. To go. Yeah,
although those other campaigns like I'm thinking of Storm King's Thunder, right? Storm King's Thunder comes to it's one of my critiques of Storm King's Thunder. It is an adventure all about dealing with the aftermath of the craziness of the destruction of the Ordning, and at the end, you don't really deal with the destruction of the Ordning at all, right? So you could definitely start over at level 1 and have new characters dealing with the Ordning itself. In a way that campaign doesn't, but then you're still homebrewing. You can't really run an existing campaign that then addresses that. You can steal things from other campaigns, sure. But you're still gonna have to make your own story. Which at that point, maybe you're ready to do that because you've run a published adventure. You're ready to sort of flex your creative muscles.
Yeah, I'd say so. I think another thing is, like we're talking about celebrating those features of high-level D&D, let them have a cape walk, let them show off their powers. And I think something you can do if you are looking to actually play at those high levels is just basically throw in the kitchen sink. There are monsters and there are magic items that are high level, and you look at them and you think, this is ridiculous. How could I ever put this into my campaign and have it make any sense? Well, once you get to those higher levels and you're thinking about extraplanar entities and all that kind of stuff, just throw it in. Find any kind of contrived reason will do, because what's more interesting is the thing itself. The classic example, I suppose, is the deck of many things. People look at that and they think, this thing's crazy. It's broken. You see that so often. This magic item is broken. Well, yeah, I think that's kind of the point. It's there to be played with. It's there to mess up your campaign. And sure, you probably don't want to do that when they're going through the meat and the bones of it. But actually, once they're coming out the tail end and everything's starting to wrap up, well, give them fun toys to play with. And that can come in the form of giving them magic items, but it can also come in the form of giving them challenges that are just totally off the wall and you wouldn't normally expect to have in your encounters.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a bit of a weird question. Do we have examples of stories outside of games that were adventures that were written, of stories where we think characters had a good end, and then what could we use from that to help DMs?
Yeah. Good.
I think if you're talking in terms of books and movies and TV shows, other than the ones that get prematurely canceled, they tend to, because they're focused entirely on sort of creating a satisfying narrative arc, that they tend to do that, which is why it sometimes feels unfinished in a campaign, because you don't get the same sort of satisfying arc that a movie or a TV show or a book does.
That again, how many times have we watched the final episode of a long series and everyone hates it? Yeah, no matter what it is, because it's the end. Is it human nature that we just don't want it to end? I don't know.
Well, and the other thing I'm thinking about are things like Wheel of Time, where we start off and there actually are characters that are pretty high level that we don't know are high level because it's not really their story. Right. And it's like if we ever end it with them, it would could potentially feel unsatisfying with that.
Yeah, and that's a good point, right? Is that a lot of times the popular culture stories that we have, the stories might have a satisfying ending, but even then they're not focused on the high-level characters, right? We don't necessarily have a super satisfying ending of Gandalf's story. We have a satisfying ending of Frodo's story, and he's not high-level, you know? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, you're right. Do we need another chapter describing what happens to Gandalf? Probably not, because he's not the point of the story.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, actually, is that sometimes, well, I think probably quite a lot, the more I think about it, the more I realize this to be true, is that the character arcs and the narrative arcs that we see in, books, fiction, whatever, they aren't really coded in the same way as Dungeons and Dragons campaigns or role-playing game campaigns, because, Frodo doesn't become this amazing sword wielding. He doesn't turn into a 20th level monk and start bouncing off the walls of Mount Doom. He just goes home afterwards, and that is the satisfying kind of arc of it all. And I think, maybe it is hard to find examples in the books we read, in the films we watch on TV. It is hard to find examples of characters really leveling up, and then getting to this amazing state, and then just saying, "Well, yeah, I'm done now. This is fine." I think. Yeah, it's a hard question, actually. I
mean, there are some. If you focus on D&D stories or D&D novels specifically, you can definitely see some arcs like that. Like you can watch Raceland level up through the Dragonlance series. At the same time, you also have some where you can watch Drizzt level up till about 12 or 13, and then he stops. Right? He's been 12 or 13th level for 20 books now. So, because that's sort of the meat and potatoes of where Bob wants to tell those stories.
Yeah. And that just makes me wonder, and I did not prepare this line of thinking at all for this episode, is would it make sense to go talk to the folks that did, was it the Marvel one? The Cortex Plus superheroes game? Because one of the problems they had faced was the fact, like, how do you have... Basically, his characters are already powerful. Superheroes have their power already, and how do you tell a compelling story once they've gotten to that level? Which sounds like a similar problem to here.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about that as we've been talking about this. Is that I read a lot of comics, and in a comic book story, like you can have high level, Superman stories or whatever that come to a satisfying narrative arc. Now, we know, because it's Superman and he's been constantly in publication for almost 100 years, that they're going to be telling more stories and that the story's not over, right? But at least that narrative comes to a satisfying conclusion. And I think you can borrow some of that from a little bit of, a little bit of Superman here, a little bit of, Dragonlance there, and come up with a style of story that works in a D&D campaign, because ultimately playing a campaign in a role-playing game is different than reading a book or watching a movie or whatever, right? So the stories, the narratives have to function differently as well.
Yeah, you have those pesky players who keep getting involved.
Right?
It may not hurt to, at the end of the campaign, to have sort of a session 0 2.0 and say, all right, we finished this campaign. Where from here do you want to go? And that can help you. If the players say, we're 13th level, we just want to see what our 20th level characters can do.
Right.
Just have them create 20th level characters and run some one long madcap 20th level session to let them use all their powers. And maybe that's the conclusion they actually want. And then you don't have to create a level 14 to 19 set of adventures on your own. You can just create that 120th level madcap romp and let it happen.
Yeah, for sure.
And a lot of times you'll hear that from players who haven't played high level very much, and there's a lot of them.
Oh yeah.
They just want to see what high level play is like. And at that case, I would almost even recommend, like, from my experience, because I've done some I think all of my campaigns in the last decade or two have finished at level 20 or 30-ish, depending on which edition I'm playing, right? And I always build my campaigns with the end in mind, because I know I want to be aiming towards this narrative arc, and so I sort of, before I even introduce Session 0, I already have the final scene in my head, and that helps me build some narrative consistency towards a goal. But yeah, so I've played at that high level before, and I would almost argue, like, if your characters feel like they've reached a satisfying conclusion in terms of story, and you've got that itch to play high level play, it's not necessarily the best idea to then just level up those characters to level 20 and play them, because it kind of takes away from this satisfying ending that you had. Just make new characters. Run your level 20 one-shot or two-shot or whatever. Get that experience, scratch that itch, and see what that's like, right? Have fun with that. But it doesn't have to be a continuation of the characters, because that's a lot harder to pull off without diminishing the narrative arc that you've already concluded with them.
Yeah, it depends on the players. It depends on the DM. But yeah. I could totally see that, yeah.
Yeah. And I will, if it's all right, I'll just give a little, I guess it's kind of a plug, because I am involved tangentially with it. If it is really the wanting to experience the mechanical side of things rather than the narrative side of things, have a look on DM's Guild, because there are supplements there that go up above. I mean, I want to give a special shout out to Mark Outfaldish and Quill and Cauldron, they have epic characters is the name of this supplement, which is actually 20th to 30th level. They've gone outside the bounds of what's published within 5e, and they've tried to continue it and make it interesting. And it's a totally different style of play. Don't expect to come into it feeling the same way as you feel in 12th level. Go up and above and just continue that power escalation. There's stuff out there. It's not official, but it's well researched, it's well developed. There's stuff out there that you can use to help you do
absolutely. And that goes, I mean, that's been happening in gaming, in D&D specifically, for a long time, right? I have this old gold cover, almost pamphlet style book from 2nd edition that was about what do you do after 20th level that eventually makes you a god. I don't know. Sean has that knowing look on his face. Do you know which book I'm talking about?
I don't know the name of the book, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
And in 3rd edition, I think it was the Epic Level Handbook sort of did the same thing. So this is a thing that people have been doing in D&D for a long time. And I should give a shout out to, is it 2C Gaming? Does a series of high-level products as well, and is having some good luck with that. So.
Well, it's even, to some extent, it's even covered a little bit in the Dungeon Master's Guide. There is a section in the DMG about epic boons and talking about playing beyond 20th level. There is support for it. And, I think, I hate to loop back round, but I do think that most people just aren't really that interested in doing super high-level D&D, because it doesn't really feel the same, I don't think. It's a kind of different game of its own.
We found that. With 4th edition, I think we found that each tier was sort of its own
game,
special snowflake. Yeah,
but especially the epic tier. I mean, you could follow the evolution from 1st tier to 2nd tier. Sort of made sense, and then that 3rd tier was still like, okay, now we are into superhero gaming in a way that we haven't been before. So, and I think I think it was Sean mentioned the idea of having sort of a Session 0 2.0 after you finish a narrative arc. to say, okay, so where are we at, and where do you want to go, and what's happening here? And I think that belies the ever existing advice of make sure you're keeping open lines of communication, make sure you're talking to each other, and that like I have. With that same character that I mentioned before that has this rival that keeps coming back over and over again, she also has this narrative arc of she is a tiefling who's actually from Dis. And in her backstory, her soul is already promised to Dispater or whoever. And so she's got this other storyline of like, I don't want to go. Like, I don't want my soul to go there, but it's like ironclad, so to speak. What am I going to do? I can't get out of this. And so she's got this other story arc going on and these other goals going on. And I've made sure, as we've gotten into the last few months here, as we're wrapping up Curse of Strahd and we're digging into more of their personal stories as well. I've been talking to her a lot about like, okay, so how satisfying of a conclusion to this story would it be if that specific thing never paid off? Because I could totally see using her as an NPC wandering around in Avernus when we get to Descent into Avernus, still looking for a way to break that contract. Now she's gone back to hell to do it. So but I'm keeping the lines of communication open with her. Like, okay, I understand, like, what are the important parts you want to hit? And which parts can we maybe not hit and make sort of the epilogue of the story, and then years later she was still doing these things, sort of thing. And that's okay too. Like, as I think Tracy was pointing out earlier with a lot of books and novels and whatever, like, books and novels are the same thing. Books and movies and TV shows and that kind of stuff, right? Is that sometimes you can hit a satisfying ending to a story that doesn't actually tie up all the loose threads. Like, it's okay. Like, okay, this story is done. We're not going to hear any more about this character. And then they rode off into the sunset to deal with all these other things going on in their lives. And we don't have to know how that goes. Sometimes but the players have to know that, or feel like that's going to be satisfying for them as well.
Yeah, I think, a DM is expected to wear a lot of different hats. But the one hat they don't need to wear is that of the psychic, right? You should just ask. Ask and you shall receive, as it was. As long as you're open with your players, and as long as you've got a good dialogue with them, they might just say vagities, like, oh, we just want more. But at least that's something, you'll have an idea from them of what it is they're looking for, whether it's the narrative, whether it's the mechanical. You'll get a feeling for how they want things to flow and what, as we've been saying kind of from the beginning, what's going to be a satisfying end for their character.
Yeah. One of the things that we did when we wrote the Acquisitions Incorporated hardcover was try to get the DM to ask the players what they want in terms of downtime and franchise activities for that book, because getting that dialogue going isn't something that just happens at the beginning or the end of a session or the beginning and the end of the campaign. It's something that should be constantly going, and it doesn't have to always be what do you want to do, but it can be just presenting a bunch of options and seeing which ones they take. And you can then see what either the player themselves or the character themselves wants when they make these choices. When I was running my campaign set in the Acquisitions Incorporated world, it turned out that the downtime was their favorite part. And they would spend more time doing downtime activities and making business deals than they did actually venturing. And when we finished the campaign, they wanted to go to a new setting, but they still wanted to do the downtime and the business things in Icewind Dale. So, they just wanted that feeling replicated in a new campaign. So it was very easy to stop at 7th level there, go to this new place, but keep that same tone, because the tone was what they were looking for rather than the story.
Now, it occurs to me that we are, 52 minutes into the recording. And one of the main things that the original email I was asking about was, how do you adapt things? Like, we talked a lot about how to homebrew things for the higher level play and for the continued campaign. But we haven't talked much about how do you adapt existing modules, whether it's mashing them up together or just stacking them one right after another. And I mentioned that I've done both, right? I talked about my current campaign where I ran Dragon Heist, went into Curse of Strahd, and now I'm into the homebrew section, but I'm absolutely I'm not making all of that up. I'm ripping that dungeon right out of Tomb of Annihilation, and I've got a potential seat out there for Dungeon of the Mad Mage if they want to dive down and find Hallister and deal with that. I don't know if they ever will, but that's an option they have. So I'm stealing things from modules that I don't think I'll ever get a chance to actually run with them, but I can totally just rip a thing out of it and use it, right? That said, there is the question then of balance. So balance is relatively easy right now. The dungeon in Tomb of Annihilation is a death trap dungeon. It is intended to be very difficult and deadly. So the fact that they're level 13 going into it, I'm just sort of leaving it as is, because then maybe it won't quite be so deadly, and that'll fit well, right? And we'll see as they go deeper, if I need to change some DCs or whatever. But if they get to level 18 and I'm tearing a dungeon out of another adventure, or I'm tearing a bad guy out of another adventure or whatever, there might be some consideration for, okay, but how do I pump that up and make that appropriate? Any thoughts on that?
I think Josh already said that reskinning is the DM's best.
That's
friend.
true.
Right? You can stick any monster in any place, change its name, change its appearance, but all the attacks are the same, all the DCs are the same, and the Dungeon Master's Guide in Xanathars does a good job of talking about traps and how to balance those in terms of damage and difficulty. I don't think that is as hard a lift as creating your own story from scratch, for sure. And the other thing I think is that we are blessed to have a hobby where the big bad dudette is evil, and they're trying to overthrow the world in this adventure and that adventure and that adventure and in that adventure. So swap them out. They're trying to overthrow the world. They're probably in some sort of dungeon. It's not a terrible stretch of the imagination to figure out how that all fits with the story that you're telling.
And one of the things I'm doing is I'm specifically when I'm figuring out what other kinds of stories to tell in this third act, I'm thinking about the kinds of stories that have been told and trying to do something different, right? We did the urban investigation. We did the gothic horror. Now let's do a death trap dungeon. One of the locations, I've got plans for pulling out the Unearthed Arcana mass combat rules. And let's play with that and see how that works. Let's just do some different things so that it doesn't feel too monotonous. We're always sort of experimenting and experiencing different things as well. And that can address some of the higher level, as you're bringing in other modules, as you're adapting them. Look for things that are a little bit different than what you've been doing. I don't know that I would, as I say, I don't know that I would rip sections out of Rime of the Frost Maiden right after running Curse of Strahd, because it's kind of horror into a slightly different version of isolation and horror. But at the same time, the end of Rime of the Frost Maiden actually rips out really well and gets applied other places, and I think is different enough, because it's not really that isolation horror sort of story at that point, that there are some places where you can do that.
I know we kind of touched on this. Sorry, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but think about what will work well. So we talked about puzzles earlier. Puzzles kind of work well at any level. But there are other examples of things. A murder mystery will work just fine at any level, really. It's the process is just the characters discovering clues and then solving the mystery, right? So, in terms of that, in comparison to a big trap-filled dungeon, it's going to be easier to run because you don't have to change quite so much. It's kind of about the process of role-playing through it more than it is making the ability checks to find certain clues and stuff. I encourage people to think about what's going to be easiest for them to convert to higher level, because it's not always, there's a bit of a disparity.
Well, and I would argue that be wary, I guess, a little bit of like converting over the murder mystery, because when you get to higher level play, you're throwing out high level divination spells that just give you the answer, right? Don't be prepared for that. Like if you're going to tell that kind of a story, you got to pull some tricks to make it work. It's not just
to be honest. At this point, at low level, they have all those tricks. Anyway.
Right, a lot of them.
You have characters that can read minds at first level,
right?
So yeah, you have to be careful no matter what when you do murder mysteries.
Now, the other thing that Sam, the original emailer, brought up is actually the other thing that I've done, right? And I've talked about this a lot on Behind the DM Screen, and so people who've listened to that are familiar with my previous campaign, my last campaign in before I moved from North Carolina here to Indiana, where we ran level 1 to 20. But it was basically me saying, I'm never going to get a chance to run a bunch of these adventures. And they all there's several of them that kind of deal with this horrible evil that was so bad that all of the gods, both good and evil, had to team up on them to trap them, right? And so I decided that I was going to have... Out of the Abyss and Princes of the Apocalypse, and then I took the second edition Rod of Seven Parts module, and I just said Miska and Therazdan are actually the same entity with different names, and that the reason the demon lords were unleashed in the Underdark was because Miska / Therazdan's agents were like, we need to keep all the heroes busy with some really big thing while we're dealing with trying to free Miska, right? And that ended up being a 1 to 20 campaign that worked because I took them all and I sort of mashed them up, and there were some spots where they were maybe a little a level or two ahead of where the book said they should be, and you just sort of fudge the numbers. I got some great advice actually on Behind the DM Screen from Mike Shea from Sly Flourish. Little plug for Mike, even though he's not here. Where he talked about like they were the first few times they ran into demon lords, like it wasn't enough of a challenge for such a big deal. You're fighting a demon lord, and it should have been harder, right? And he pointed out first of all the really simple advice of like the monster hit points that are listed are averages. And it doesn't make sense to follow the averages if it's your big bad villain. And if there's only one Juablex, why would they even list the average? Give her the maximum hit points. She's the only Juablex, right? And the other thing that I really liked was instead, when they have a multi-attack listed, don't give them... Basically, it came down to... This wasn't exactly what he said, but this is how I ran it and it worked. When it says multi-attack, 3 attacks or whatever... Don't make that 3 attacks. Make that just 3 separate actions. So now they can attack, and throw out a spell. At least once. Don't let them have 3 spells or whatever, right? But let them throw out a spell or a spell-like ability every round because they're the big bad and they need to be doing crazy things and it's supposed to be tough. And that advice worked really well in terms of scaling up things because they were. The thing that Out of the Abyss says was a 15th level final encounter, they were like 17th level at the time. So I needed to sort of push it, and then converting the Rod of Seven Parts was easy because it's already a second edition adventure, so I was doing all the mechanical stuff on that one as it was. So
yeah. I think when it comes to my own personal DMing style, I take that a step further as well. Like, to me... A lot of the time, especially for big bads, they don't have hit points. They've got turns, right? They're going to be here for a number of turns. Really mind how much damage the characters are doing. Like even at low levels, I'm rounding it up to. It's hard for me to do mental maths. It's not my big skill. So I'm rounding it to the nearest 5. Sorry, but
what would be really interesting? You bring up that they don't have hit points. They have turns. It might be really interesting to say, this villain has 20 turns. Just ignore the hit points. They have 20 turns, and every time it feels like you've done enough damage, they lose a turn. They'll die 1 turn earlier. And so then you got like just a string of check boxes, and you're checking them off from the left to the right as the turns go by. You're checking them off from the right to the left as they do enough damage, until eventually, okay, this feels like a satisfying conclusion, and you've slain the big bad. So I'll check off that last box.
In many ways, that's kind of what hit points are anyway, right? We're giving them enough hit points to last long enough to do all their cool stuff.
That's interesting.
When you look at, especially when you look at the rules. I'm going to put that in inverted commas. The rules, the guidance, maybe for determining the challenge rating of a monster you've created yourself. It's kind of wonky. A lot has been said about challenge rating and how it can kind of be a little bit misleading, or it doesn't always hold up at higher levels. I mean, I know Mike right. Especially, I know has gone off the rails on some stuff. But it's true. It's hard to balance these things at high levels. So just do what feels narratively right. And I think it's hard for new GMs, I think, to get that into their head because they're thinking, well, hang on, these are the rules. These are the rules written in the book. I'm gonna read the rules and follow the rules.
Right.
But as you become more experienced, I think you get to realize that everything needs to be bent to suit your group. Nothing is going to work perfectly for everybody's group. So adapt it. You have to adapt it, I think.
And I think that's important advice, especially coming from people like you and Sean who are publishing material, to hear that like what you have to do as publishers is different than what you expect DMs to be doing at their table. Like a published book, you need to fit it within the framework and within the mechanics that the game presents. But you also are telling people, but that doesn't mean that that's how you have to run it at your table. Like, do what you need to do to make it satisfying.
Sorry, go on. No, go on.
I was going to say, I think I'm hearing from you guys a lot of it is more about that narrative and understanding that probably more than balance. But if you're publishing, you have to, particularly for like Adventures League, right, there's a lot of rules you have to fit in within as you're doing stuff. The other thing I was going to throw out to try to remember are, like, when they're at higher levels, they have ways of dealing with what we would typically consider balance issues like death and things like that. So those probably aren't the things that we're going to care as much about necessarily when we think of narrative balance. And then if we just let them have a cakewalk, they're probably not going to feel that sense of fulfillment from the story they're playing in. And maybe that's where you start thinking about, maybe I do make this encounter unbalanced, but they can still get a win narratively for themselves, or they put something at risk that they then have to get back, and then they'll feel better about it, even though it was completely unfair any mechanical way, like crunch way. People would be like, that's just, why would you ever do that?
Yeah. I mean, what makes D&D great and what makes D&D problematic is that constant tension between D&D as a storytelling vehicle and D&D as a game with a lot of moving parts and a lot of mechanics. And any designer, any DM, any player, whether that's what you're feeling or not, that's what you're feeling. You're feeling that tension of player A wants just to look at his or her book and do by the rules. Player B wants to tell their story, and that's all they want. And right there, you're creating an almost untenable experience unless you are a DM that can really balance those two things. So it's always there. It's constantly there, that tension.
You should like teach a class about game design.
You think? maybe I'll try that next week.
Yeah, talk to your local college or university and see if they'll have a spot for you, huh?
There you go.
For people who don't know, Sean is teaching a class. Which institution?
It's Fredonia State University of New York.
There you go. So there you go. Awesome. All right. So we have talked for well over an hour, and I think we've hit the big questions that the email brought up and that I wanted to sort of discuss. Does anybody have, or who has last thoughts, things that you wanted to bring up that we haven't talked about yet?
I guess just one tip, I suppose, for high level play, where it says DC, just get rid of that bit. Just get rid of the save. If they touch the thing, it kills them. They've got ways to solve it. They'll be fine.
Well, you know what? Again, I keep going back because I'm running it right now. The Dungeon in Tomb of Annihilation, because it's a death trap dungeon, very much has that kind of thing, right? There's a lot of stuff where it's just like, no, if you do it right, it goes fine. If you don't do it right, it goes poorly. And there's not a lot of hints about how to do it right. You're just going to have to be powerful or lucky. So,
yeah.
And my last tip is, if you're the DM, you will have as many solutions to your problem of continuing the campaign as you have players. So make sure that you listen to your players. Make sure You start talking early, planning early for what you're going to do, so then you can drop those hooks in if it's going to be a continuing campaign or a restart with different characters in the same world or whatever you're going to do. It's an expectation that you can meet.
Perfect. And
then
yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say quickly too, because we talked earlier about the 2 points that come into tension a lot. Another set that can come into tension are the people who want to be surprised and see something new and different and not want to know what happens, versus the people who, like we were saying earlier, want to tell a specific story and don't want to put that at risk. And understanding that as you're doing the thing that Sean just said is probably pretty important too.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that's a great point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes back to the idea of like keep those lines of communication going, keep talking to players and what have you. Like the one character whose rival kept showing up, she had written a monologue of exactly how she wanted that final encounter to go, and it's not how things went. And she and I were talking to the point that she was okay with that. Like she just likes to write. She likes the creative writing part of it, and she's writing constantly like monologues and dreams that her character has and whatever. So she enjoyed writing that, even if that's not how it played out, because she liked the surprise, but still having that like I look at those things and say, okay, what is it that she really wants though? Like she wants to be able to like close the door on this chapter of her life and move on to trying to figure out what the next chapter of this character's life is. And she there's these things that she's trying to accomplish, and the specific opportunity to use this monologue that she wrote is not necessarily the important part. And when he comes back as a giant slavering Armageddon beast that I've gotten from the Book of Fiends from Green Ronin, or Apocalypse Beast or whatever, that it's insane. That'll be satisfying as well, I think. and she'll definitely be surprised. I hope she's not listening to this. All right.
Maybe she'll be surprised.
Yeah, there you go. All right, so I think it's time to call this the end of the episode.
We'd like to dice.com and to our guests. Sean, where can folks find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Sean Merwin. I do a podcast. You can follow that on Twitter. It is now called Mastering Dungeons. On Twitter, it's
I introduced you wrong.
Mastering DND. That's okay. Sometimes I get it wrong too.
Okay.
And you can follow my work that will be being more and more of it will be announced on Ghostfire Gaming. So keep an eye on that.
Awesome. And Josh, where can folks find you?
Yeah, Twitter and Facebook at JVC Parry, my website, jvcparry.com. And my next solo project will be Peculiar Children, which is going to be a little indie micro RPG for Zine Quest 3. And I think probably my next kind of freelance piece of work will be Wondrous Expeditions from Lawsmith. So keep your eyes open for that too.
You do some work with Nord Games. I basically backed the Kickstarter for their Crafting and Alchemy book just because I knew you were working on it, so I wanted to.
Oh, wow. Thanks.
Yeah,
that means a lot. Yeah, they're currently halfway through Dangerous Destinations. That's their current Kickstarter. So if you like Nord stuff, that's definitely the one to check out.
There you go.
Awesome. And we'd also like to say thanks to all of you who support us by being patrons at patreon.com/The Tome Show. And
it's been a while. I realized as I was preparing the script for this that we haven't recorded a regular sort of numbered episode since October. So it's been a while since I've shouted out our patrons. So we want to say thanks to some of our new patrons like Jeff Matthews, James D'Alessio, Derek Heath, as well as our returning champions Doug Palmer, Hyperlexic, Jill Sanders, Leonard Pelche, and Merrick Blackman. If you want to get a hold of the show, you can email thetomeshow@gmail.com. That goes right to me, and so then I can get it to where it needs to go. You can also find Tracy on Twitter. She is at Sarah with an H Dark Magic. And you can find me. I am at Squatch, SQUACH. And the show on Twitter is at The Tome Show, although that's mostly me, although there's a few other people that post from there as well. But if you get a reply or a retweet, it's probably me. Yeah, so that's where to find us.
And that's episode 346, where we figured out how to make the story never end. Well, almost never. In this episode of...
The Tome. So it's the never-ending story campaign that we're telling now? I mean,
That's what it sounds like you want it.
Yeah, well, you've definitely heard of people running campaigns, the same campaign for 30, 40 years. That's basically a never-ending story.
Yeah, it's true. My characters are 80th level now, and we've actually run every published adventure ever.
Well, and I think what happens is you end up with people who, those campaigns, you just got to get used to the fact that you're not going to level, except every 4 or 5 years you might gain a level, right? Yeah. That's one of the things I didn't that I thought about and then I never brought it up, but. For those people watching the stream or watching this on YouTube later, one of the things that I oftentimes will do is when you get into that third tier, or I guess in 5th ed it's the 4th tier, right? That high level play. I experience points aside, whatever the math of the game says, I don't care. My campaigns, you start leveling up pretty fast at the end. I want that last third act to be like bang, 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 like high point after high point after high point. Like every time something big happens, and something big should be happening every 2 or 3 sessions, you gain a level.
Level at the speed of plot, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, my players were shocked because in Curse of Strahd, it was months between leveling, and then they got back, and I had them fight a big bad like 2 sessions later, and I'm like, all right, gain a level. They're like, wait, what? Already? And they're like, yep, this is how we're going. Hang on. So, all right, say goodbye to the stream. Oh, did you do all that?
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Fantastic.
Nice.
Thanks. Sorry, I think so.
Wow.
It's a little fuzzy, but yeah.
All
Yeah,
right.
Beautiful. I'm sure you'll tweet it out afterwards, right?
Yeah.
People get a
It's because I have that blur.
Oh, the background.
Oh, yeah.
Here, let me fix it.
I specifically put a bunch of D&D art behind me, so I don't do any... There we go.
Oh, nice.
Oh,
that's
yeah.
good. Awesome. Right.
Thanks.
Very good.
Well,
All right.
and Tracy, it was great to see you again.
Yeah. Say goodbye to the stream. I'm gonna transition to the end for them.